I just spent the last couple of days in Rockport, Massachusetts at my sister's and husband's house. It's the home of the motif number one. Some claim, well, it is the most painted building in the United States, and some people say in the world. Unfortunately, it blew down in a huge storm a few years ago, and they built a replica. Kind of a sad thing now because I don't think people paint it much anymore. But at one time, when I was young, when I was a boy, there'd be lines of artists painting this building all day. Now, been a couple days, but we've always talked about liquidity in the market. We talk about there's usually a major negative liquidity event before the market goes down, and counterparty exposure. These are the two things that actually kind of affect the plumbing of our system, our financial system. And now we're faced with this situation with First Brands and Tricolor, and we're going to find out. People are saying Carvana and so forth, but we'll find out. But I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about how this stuff actually comes about, and then you can make up your mind where we are in this situation. Now, I just want to say that here are the facts, right? They're saying there's $3 trillion in assets under management. Some people put it closer to 4.1 trillion. So no small. And they're saying by 2029, there'll be 5 trillion or more. I'd like to see if that actually happens. Now, total lending in the world, all banks, everybody, is $2.2 trillion, okay? So they're about 4 times the size of the private credit market. And they go through it, but literally we're interested in this last sentence here. Private credit has grown to sizable and systemic alternative pool. What do they mean by systemic? It's getting so big it's a systemic risk. Filling the higher yield and less regulated lending niches. Higher yield, less regulated niches. Now, after the great financial crisis, we put in rules that the banks couldn't do certain kind of lending. If they did this lending, they have to come up with a lot more capital, okay? And so these guys decided, hey, since we're not allowed to do it, why don't we just give the money to private credit and let them do it? So when you look at our 6 GSIBs, globally systemic important banks, we've given them, I know it's over 100 billion now, but let's say 80 to 100 billion dollars, okay, that we have given to the private credit people, all right, the less regulated people, but higher yield. And that's what the banks are doing. We give you this money, you give us a higher yield than we can go get ourselves. And by the way, the government won't let us go get it ourselves. Now, we've talked about this before. Gensler, who is under Biden, tried to pass a rule that private credit has to have an independent pricing every quarter, okay, so that we know what our private credit is worth, all right? And they went to court, and the Magda judge down in New Orleans said that, geez, guess what? The head of the SEC, who rules over all the rules for all investments, does not have the legal right to tell private credit to get third-party valuations and tell the shareholders how much their credit is worth. He said, so our own regulatory agency doesn't have the legal power to tell the companies, to tell us how much this is worth. And in fact is under the new administration, they have come up with what they call principle-based disclosure, okay? It refers to a regulatory approach that emphasizes broad disclosure objectives rather than rigid prescriptive line item requirements, all right? In other words, they don't have to tell us anything. And in practice, what does this mean? Well, providing meaningful investor relevant information reflecting the entity's unique risk profiles and operation. Avoid boilerplate and immaterial details, thus reducing disclosure overload. Yes, that's the biggest problem I can see in the markets, is that we have too much information from our companies. And using management judgment and context to determine how best to communicate risk and financial condition, i.e., pricing, rather than rigid templates. And you can read the rest here. Stop and read it. It's disgusting. So, since we can just disclose what we want, then that means that we can price the items in our portfolio, the loans in our portfolio, the way we think is the best way. Management judgment, okay? This is what the SEC says they can do, all right? So here's the bonds for First Brands, okay? And notice where they were priced right before they basically went to zero, all right? Now, you sit there and you say, well, they didn't know they were going to go bankrupt, so they priced it there. Well, actually, they all did. Here's First Brands marks at the end of the first quarter, okay? Look at them. I love this Monroe Capital Income, 101 and a quarter. They're above par, all right? So everyone prices them like this because the SEC says, hey, it's your judgment. We trust you, and we don't want too much information, because if we get too much information, what are we going to do? It's overload. They don't want information overload. So who are these paragons of professionalism that we trust their judgment to tell us what we should know without overloading us with information? Well, here they are, okay? And they tell you how much money they've got invested. So here's the issue and what it means to us. You have these corporations who have taken in trillions of dollars, 3 to 4, make up your mind, you can call it, all right, that they're getting paid 1% to 2% on. So, would you rather receive, in your judgment as the management, would you rather receive 1% to 2% on, we'll say 4 trillion, instead of 1% to 2% on, let's say, less than 3 trillion, or let's say 2 trillion? Because what should these bonds actually be priced at, right? Should they have been down 30%, 40, 50, 60, 80? They're 90 in one day. But I'm not here to say everything should be 90. I'm saying if we looked at this portfolio and actually were third-party priced, I would bet, I don't know, I don't think anyone does, because they don't want to give us too much information. We may actually figure this out, that they would be down 40 to 50%. So instead of getting 1% to 2% on 4 trillion, they get 1% to 2% on 2 trillion. And by the way, that 2 trillion wouldn't be there very long, okay? But that's not the only problem. Remember what we're talking about here. We're talking about liquidity and counterparty exposure. So you have to think of how this works through the system. We've already seen, now here is a private credit ETF, and you can see that everything is going down. So all these companies are owned by other companies, investment companies, pension funds, and so forth, right? And guess what? They're levered too. So down they come. So again, liquidity coming out of the market. And this is a double street here. We have all these small banks, okay, who went out and they went to the private credit guys. So we had the big banks giving the money to the private credit guys and running their own private credit funds. And then the private credit funds turn around and sell it to our small banks because they don't have the wherewithal of our GSIBs. So now, as we all know, we are now, hopefully not, but looks like facing a crisis with all our medium-sized and small banks. So what does this mean to us? We have to look at the size of the market, guess, right? We have to guess on how it's going to pan out. So if in the end, in the next year, we end up with a 50% haircut, that's $2 trillion. Is that enough to send down the market? Like and follow, and let me know in the comments.